Hello, my name is Leo Carson. I am a second year political science student at Commonwealth University Bloomsburg. Today, I will be discussing the recent collapse of the French government and how that could affect the rest of the European Union as well as the United Nations. On Tuesday, September 9th, 2025, France's Prime Minister Francois Bayrou resigned after receiving a vote of no confidence. The day before, September 8th, 2025, 364 out of 573 lawmakers voted against the government. They only needed 280 lawmakers to vote against the government in order to force the Prime Minister to resign, but they were well above that margin. The no confidence vote came over due to budget related plans. That same day, September 9th, President Macron appointed Sébastien Lecornu as the new prime minister, so one may think that there were no issues since the prime minister has already been replaced. However, this is Macron's sixth prime minister in just 2 years. You may be asking, why are we even talking about this? Well, France is a founding member of the European Union, the only member of the EU that is a nuclear power, and they hold a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council with a veto vote. The instability of France is not just a domestic issue there, it deeply affects all of Europe and the global system. With the collapse of the French government, there would be an immediate political shock among the EU. The collapse of the government forces France to turn inwards and focus on their domestic politics rather than foreign ones. This will inevitably cause an imbalance in the Franco-German partnership. The history of this partnership fuels the European Union. Essentially, it's the glue that holds the rest of the EU together. When the partnership becomes imbalanced over and over again because a government collapses, it could have very detrimental effects on the rest of the European Union. It signals to the rest of the member states in the EU that if France falters, the European Union looks fragile. This could cause other member states to leave the Union and follow in the steps of the United Kingdom a little bit ago. There have been very real impacts on the European Union due to these frequent government collapses. The European Union may also struggle to pass any major decisions without the leadership of France, since it's such a powerful country within the Union. Since France is so powerful within the EU, other member states look to France for insight into how well the Union is doing as a whole. When France begins to have a stronger nationalist movement and is so focused on domestic politics due to governmental collapse, the EU becomes much more unstable. This rise in instability fuels the anti-EU movement across the Union. If these government collapses continue, there could also be an economic fallout. The confidence in the European market across the globe could drop, which would cause investors to pull back and sell their stocks. This, in turn, could weaken the euro, which would have a huge impact across the eurozone, which is the 20 out of 27 countries in the EU that have adopted the euro as their main currency. There are also some security implications in the European Union with this government collapse. Post-Brexit, when the UK left the European Union, France is now the only member state of the EU that is a nuclear power. When France is focused on domestic issues, the credibility of the EU defense is much lower. This leaves the whole of the European Union much more vulnerable to foreign conflicts. Adversaries such as Russia or China could decide to exploit or test members of the EU during times with a lack of French leadership, since there would likely not be as harsh consequences. In the case of a conflict in Europe during this time, it is likely that other members of NATO would need to step up in order to compensate for the weakened French leadership. What implications does this government collapse have when it comes to the United Nations? Well, France is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. When the French government collapses, as I mentioned earlier, France becomes much more focused on their domestic politics and they turn inward. This leaves one of the permanent Security Council seats effectively neutralized, which could be especially harmful during times of crisis. This reduces the United Nations' ability to act decisively on conflicts, sanctions, or peacekeeping. It also brings into question if an unstable state should be able to keep a permanent seat on the Security Council and veto vote. When France is unstable, it leaves the UN unbalanced as well, and it leaves power concentrated within the United States-Russia-China rivalry. France does have a large influence over much of Africa in addition to the EU. This influence is traditional and stems from the scramble for Africa, which was a period of rapid colonization by European countries of Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. France did colonize a lot of African countries during this time and still has a large influence over many of these countries despite them being largely independent now. If France's influence over these countries erodes, it could leave them vulnerable to being exploited by Russia or China, similarly to other European countries that France protects. Undoubtedly, the confidence in Western alliances like the EU, NATO, and UN weakens, which emboldens rivals like Russia and China. This could potentially fracture global order as non-Western blocs gain traction in the global sphere. As France is a nuclear power, there are many concerns about them having these weapons of mass destruction during times of crisis. There tends to be some global alarm over who is in control of France's nuclear weapons during time of political collapse. Since the French government seems to be collapsing relatively frequently now, allies may begin to push for stronger NATO oversight of French nuclear command during these times of national emergency. This again raises the debate of if nuclear powers should face stricter international safeguards during times of crisis. This is definitely difficult to answer by much of the global sphere and could become a larger debate if the French government keeps collapsing. All in all, though this recent French governmental collapse did not cause much international turmoil, in the future, if it happens again on a larger scale, it could be detrimental to the global community. If the French government collapses, it brings a whole entourage of issues such as the European Union becoming unstable, the United Nations will become dysfunctional, and there is a greater risk of nuclear safety. I ask, how is the rest of the global system supposed to be held together if one central pillar collapses?